Hey guys, how's it going? This is Ina, and I'm excited to welcome you all today to a new online course focused on mastering wet-on-wet when painting with watercolor. Wet-on-wet can be a pretty nerve-wracking technique to master, especially for beginners, because it deals with paint consistency problem and there is an element of timing. But it really doesn't need to be that complicated. I hope in this three-part video series, I will get to demonstrate to you every possible mistakes that can happen during the wet-on-wet process, but also a lot of foolproof way that you can mitigate and preemptively prevent this type of mistakes from happening. Like I mentioned, this is a three-part video series. The first part is about adjacent washes, such as connecting shapes and washes of different color and striving to achieve a smooth transition. The second part is about additive washes, which is applying a second coat of paint when the first coat is not yet dry. The third part is about subtractive washes, when you're using scratching or paint lifting techniques to get rid of the paint in certain areas. Now, traditionally or strictly speaking, only the second part, the additive wash, is where people usually refer to as the wet-on-wet techniques. However, I do find that the other two scenarios are just as important to master, if not more tricky or common, actually. That's why I feel like I should address all of them systemically so that you can build a holistic picture about what type of washes and paint consistencies to look for in what scenario. All right, enough said. Now let's dive into the first part of working with adjacent washes. So what we have here is a scene of a European town, I would say. Doesn't matter where that is, but it has colorful buildings. We inevitably need to connect large shapes of different color together. And believe it or not, this is actually a pretty challenging process. So the most common mistake for beginners especially is not mixing enough paint when they start with a large area. And then of course, after one application, you run out of paint. So then you would think, okay, let me just go in and add a little bit more water and continue on. Now, the problem of that is now this bottom area has way more moisture than the top. So when it dries, it's going to create this line between the two, and it will look very blotchy as well. To make it more obvious, let me show you the same mistake on this center building. So the bottom of this church building is going to have a blotchiness as well. When it dries, it will become more obvious. So then the next mistake is the opposite of having too little paint. So you actually saturated your brush with a lot of paint, which is actually the right way to go. However, once you get to kind of the bottom of that shape, and the paint will start pooling into this bead. And I'm going to let that bead sit here. And over time, you will see what that bead is going to do to the art. Okay, continue on. Now I'm painting the orange building next to the yellow building, and then went on to paint the floor, which is a light beige color. Now I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the third common mistake, because usually paint travels downwards, and you paint it in the opposite direction, meaning that you're painting the bottom area first and then paint the object on top of it. What it's going to do is that the top objects will push all of the water downwards and bleed into this bottom area, in this case, the floor. So when it dries, the bottom will have a blotchiness to it. All right, so then the last mistake I'm going to demonstrate here is by painting this building on the right-hand side. But note that this painting has way more pigment than the light yellow building, which actually has more water. So what's going to happen is that this orange building is going to push into this light yellow building almost too much. So you're not going to be able to control the border really if you put a much thicker paint adjacent to a much more watery area. Now let's take a look at the mistakes when it's fully dried up. You can tell that the bead we did not soak up obviously has a very severe cauliflower shape around it. And I almost bleed into the building next to it too. Same with this light yellow building that bled into the ground area. And for the sky and this church building in the center, where we switched from using paint, but not enough of it. So the bottom is much lighter and has this line dividing the two. Now that we have covered the mistakes you could be making with the light wash, I also want to talk about some mistakes which are related but not exactly the same when you apply the mid-tone wash. So the first mistake you could be making with the mid-tone wash is you did not let the first coat dry up fully. So here, for example, the background building is still wet, but I'm just too eager to get started with this cast shadow here on the red building. So I went in and inevitably it bled into this wet area in the back. And the second mistake, which pertains more to the mid-tone wash, is when you overmix the color and ended up having a very muddled look of the shadow area. So here I am mixing and mixing until this color become a total neutral gray. And then I come in and apply it to the building. But then I really end up with a very boring, kind of flat looking area of the shadow. And to make matters worse, I decided, well, this looks a bit too brown. Maybe I should go in and add a little bit more of a cool color. So I applied another layer of the ultramarine blue. But what you're doing here is it's going to just continue blend and add to the muddiness of that initial gray. Now, the next mistake is as similar to the light wash problem that we've seen, where the consistency of the paint next to each other don't match up. So for example, here, after I'm done with this church building and continue on with the building next to it, somehow this mixture is way more watery. It started to bleed into the church building area. That will create blotchiness as well when it dries. Now let me really quickly finish the rest of the figures and shadows. And last but not least, so I'm demonstrating to you what typically may happen if you keep working the paint to the point it's overworked. So maybe adding some extra layers here and there. But because watercolor is a transparent medium, each layer and each brush mark is going to show through. And that is going to detract from the freshness of the area and just doesn't appear as confident as compared to someone who just did it in all one attempt. Now that we've seen the mistakes you could be making, let's look at the proper way to do it or ways to mitigate these mistakes. So the first mistakes of doing the light wash is not having enough paint on the brush and having to go back to mixing more water and thus ruining the paint consistency. Now the best way to mitigate this is before you start applying paint to paper, really mix several puddles of all of the colors that you plan to use in that first wash. For this scene, that means mixing the color of the buildings, including the oranges, the yellow, and the brown, and then also pre-mix the sky color. When you start applying, make sure the brush is loaded with pigment. If you want to create a gradation, you can still dip into the water, but you need to make sure you first soak up the water before you continue on. Now I'm loading in the orange color I have pre-mixed for the center building. Both the orange and the blue area has sufficient paint on it. They're going to blend really nicely. And since we're working on these buildings on the right that are all connected, we should go on and complete the value mask on the right first. Now, regarding the mistake of working in the opposite direction of gravity, sometimes it is inevitable, however, that one may find themselves having to paint the bottom shape first and then the shape on top of the canvas. This is still doable as long as we err towards having a really wet wash for everything in that first wash. So in this case, even if we have to go back and paint this building above the ground on this side, and you see that the water is washing downwards, it is still okay because it blends into the equally wet ground area. So we can go in and push paint around and blend them really well. So when they dry up, there wouldn't be any weird blotchiness. And remember the mistake we had earlier about the pigment pulling up at the bottom of an area? Even here, it's at the bottom of the paper. It still helps to pick up this moisture at the bottom. Just use a damp, clean brush to pick it up. That way, we save ourselves from any possible bleeding from this wet area up into the artwork. And as for the mistakes of over-mixing to end up with a muddled look or very boring gray color, the way to mitigate it is exactly the same as if you were to do the light wash. Yep, you guessed it, by having a copious amount of pre-mixed colors. So here you see me start with a relatively bluish mixture for the shadow. And then I dip my brush into the burnt sienna mixture. And whenever you need to switch back to the cool gray again, just keep on dipping into the cool gray puddle. That way the tip of your brush will always have saturated and vibrant color. So when you apply that to the paper, overall it will have a much more interesting and dynamic looking shadow that is in fact made out of different shades of color versus one gray color. You see here that even if I decide to play a little bit with the shadow I've already created by adding a bit more of a different type of gray, I don't end up with creating that blotchy effect because the paint consistency of the blue, red, and yellow are in fact the same. So now let's just finish up some of the more connected shapes area, such as the figures in the sun and the umbrella in the shade. And regarding overworking, I also have a technique for you here. Imagine you do want to make certain areas darker, or maybe make the yellow building more intensified of a yellow. You can still add paint, but don't just use a very plain watery mixture. Use dry brush marks. That way you can create interesting textures that is drastically different from the flat wash. All right, now that we have seen the demonstration of the mistakes and how to avoid them, let's recap everything we have learned today regarding how to work with the adjacent washes. The first thing to keep in mind is always having a lot of pre-mixed colors before you start applying paint to paper, because different consistencies next to each other can lead to uncontrolled edges and blotchiness. It is a good idea in general to always work from top to bottom, but even if you have to switch to a different area, you will always be better off with a wet mixture than a dry one. So err on the wet side. And regarding working with the mid-tone washes,
The first thing to keep in mind is to pre-mix lots of paints, but keep the colors pure, so you don't overmix complementary colors and end up with a muddled look. When you have too much paint sometimes concentrating in one area, it is important to soak it up before the puddle dries and gives you a cauliflower effect. And the last tip here is to avoid overworking, striving towards having just one layer of application for each wash. And within that layer, have a variety of colors, as versus applying multiple layers of colors on top of each other, therefore losing the freshness of your work.
So, what do you guys think? This is the end of our first class on wet-on-wet techniques. And in the next class, we will be shifting towards working with additive washes, which is to add another layer of paint when the first coat has not yet dried. I hope you guys get the chance to practice the adjacent washes before next week's class, because this really is the foundation of watercolor painting, meaning that it's really about judging the paint consistency right. Once you can do that, then you can add the timing element on top of it, which has to do with adding the second coat on top of the correct consistency at the correct moment of dryness. Okay, I hope you all are having a wonderful day and you have learned something new from this class. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.